The train's whistle cut through the Colorado mountain air like a blade through silk, its mournful cry echoing off the snow-dusted peaks that surrounded Cedar Ridge like protective sentinels. Margaret Eleanor Hayes pressed her face against the frost-covered window, watching the small frontier town emerge from the wilderness like a fragile dream made manifest in wood and stone. Her arms ached from holding the twins during the 3-day journey, their small bodies warm against her chest even as winter's breath seemed to seep through every crack in the rail car. The conductor's voice boomed through the passenger car, announcing their arrival with the practiced indifference of a man who had seen too many hopeful souls step onto platforms that would either embrace or destroy them. Margaret shifted baby Emma in her left arm, feeling the child's fingers curl instinctively around the worn fabric of her traveling dress. Little James stirred in her right arm, his dark eyes opening to study her face with the solemn intensity that had marked him since birth. Steam hissed from beneath the great iron beast as it shuddered to a halt, and Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Through the window, she could see a small crowd gathered on the wooden platform, their breath forming white clouds in the crisp mountain air. Somewhere among those faces was Thomas Whitmore, the man who had answered her carefully worded advertisement, the rancher who had promised her safety and security in exchange for companionship and domestic skills. The other passengers began gathering their belongings, the rustle of fabric and creak of leather filling the car with sounds of departure and new beginnings. Margaret had no belongings to gather save for the small carpetbag at her feet and the precious bundles in her arms. Everything she owned in this world could be counted on her fingers. 2 wool blankets, 3 cotton dresses, a silver locket that had belonged to her mother, and the twins who had made her an outcast in Boston society. As snow falls in this story, I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from, and what's the weather like there right now? A kindly woman in the seat across from her leaned forward, her weathered face creased with concern. "You'll be fine, dear," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had raised children and buried husbands. "These mountain men may seem rough around the edges, but most have hearts as big as the sky above us." Margaret nodded gratefully, though doubt gnawed at her stomach like hunger. She had not told Thomas about the twins in her letters, could not bring herself to write the words that would surely have ended their correspondence before it began. The conductor appeared beside her seat, his uniform brass buttons catching the pale winter light streaming through the windows. "Ma'am," he said with unexpected gentleness, "this is your stop. The platform awaits, and I believe there's a gentleman out there looking mighty anxious to meet his bride." Margaret rose on unsteady legs, the twins seeming to grow heavier with each step toward the train car door. The mountain air hit her like a physical blow when she stepped onto the platform, sharp and clean and so different from the smoke-choked atmosphere of Boston that it made her dizzy. The altitude stole her breath, and for a moment she stood swaying slightly, the twins pressed close to her body for warmth. Around her, the other passengers dispersed quickly, eager to reach warm fires and hot meals, leaving her increasingly alone on the weathered wooden planks. She recognized Thomas Whitmore immediately from the tintype photograph he had sent with his second letter. He stood near the station house, a tall man with broad shoulders and a carefully trimmed beard, his hat pulled low against the wind. His eyes swept the platform methodically until they found her, and she watched his expression change from anticipation to confusion to something that looked disturbingly like disgust. He approached with measured steps, his boots heavy on the wooden platform, and stopped just beyond arm's reach. His gaze fixed on the bundles in her arms, and Margaret saw his jaw tighten beneath his beard. "You're Margaret Hayes," he said, and it was not a question but an accusation. She lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of dignity she had not known she possessed. "I am," she replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "These are my children, Emma and James. They're good babies, quiet most of the time, and they won't be any trouble to you or your household." The words tumbled out in a rush, desperate and pleading, though she tried to keep her tone matter-of-fact. Thomas Whitmore stared at her for a long moment, his breath forming angry puffs in the cold air. Then he shook his head slowly, deliberately, like a man rejecting a meal that had spoiled. "I didn't agree to take on another man's bastards," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the platform. Several people turned to stare, their faces showing varying degrees of curiosity and judgment. "I ordered a wife, not a ready-made family with questionable origins." The words struck Margaret like physical blows, each one designed to wound and humiliate. She felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold, felt the familiar shame that had driven her from Boston burning in her chest. But she did not lower her eyes, did not step backward, did not apologize for her children's existence. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "I understand your surprise, but these babies need shelter and warmth. Surely we can discuss arrangements that would be mutually beneficial. I'm an excellent cook and seamstress, and I can manage a household efficiently. The twins require little beyond basic care, and I would handle all their needs myself." He was already shaking his head before she finished speaking, his expression set in lines of absolute refusal. "I won't be the laughingstock of Cedar Ridge, taking in some Eastern woman's shame," he declared. "Find yourself another fool, Mrs. Hayes. This transaction is concluded before it began." Thomas Whitmore turned on his heel and walked away, his boots echoing hollowly on the wooden platform. Margaret watched him go, feeling something cold and heavy settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Around her, the crowd began to disperse, people returning to their business with the satisfied air of those who had witnessed someone else's misfortune. The train whistle sounded again, a final warning before departure, and Margaret realized with growing panic that she had no return ticket, no money for lodging, and nowhere to go with two babies in a town that had just witnessed her public rejection. Snow began to fall more steadily, dusting her shoulders and the twins' blankets with crystalline flakes that melted instantly against their warm skin. She stood alone on the platform as the train pulled away, its wheels grinding against the rails with mechanical indifference, carrying away her last connection to the world she had known. The station master emerged from the small building behind her, his face kind but troubled as he approached. "Ma'am," he said gently, "the next eastbound train won't arrive for 3 days, and I'm afraid the station house isn't equipped for overnight guests, especially not with little ones. Is there someone in town who might take you in until you can make other arrangements?" Margaret looked around the small frontier town, its buildings huddled together against the vastness of the Colorado wilderness like children seeking comfort from each other. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, promising warmth and shelter that seemed as distant as the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She had no money for a hotel room, no acquaintances to call upon, no plan beyond the marriage that had just crumbled before her eyes. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the wind that had begun to pick up, sending snow swirling around the platform in miniature tornadoes. Emma began to fuss, sensing her mother's distress, and James joined his sister's protests with the particular cry that meant he was both hungry and cold. From somewhere across the street, warm light spilled from windows, painting golden rectangles on the snow-covered ground. Margaret could see people moving within those squares of light, families gathering around dinner tables, children playing by firesides, the ordinary domestic scenes that represented everything she had hoped to find in this mountain town. The wind picked up strength, cutting through her wool coat as if it were made of paper, and Margaret realized that whatever happened next, she and her babies could not remain on this exposed platform much longer. The mountain night was descending with the swift finality of winter, and she needed to find shelter before the cold claimed them all. Dr. Samuel Cross had been cleaning his surgical instruments when the commotion on the platform drew his attention to the window of his clinic. Through the frost-etched glass, he watched the scene unfold with the detached interest of a man who had seen enough human cruelty to recognize it from a distance. The woman stood alone now, her dark hair whipping in the wind, two small bundles pressed against her chest like shields against the growing storm. He recognized Thomas Whitmore's broad back as the rancher stalked away from the platform, his shoulders set in the rigid line of a man who believed his righteousness justified his hardness. Samuel had delivered Whitmore's stillborn son 3 years ago, had seen the way grief could calcify a man's heart into something resembling stone. But grief was no excuse for abandoning a woman and children to a mountain winter. The twins' cries carried across the street on the wind, thin and desperate sounds that seemed to pierce the gathering dusk like needles. Samuel set down his instruments and reached for his coat, the heavy wool garment that had seen him through countless emergencies in the 2 years since he had arrived in Cedar Ridge. His medical bag sat by the door, its leather surface worn smooth by constant use, and he grabbed it without conscious thought. The station master was speaking to the woman when Samuel approached, his voice kind but helpless in the face of practical realities. "The next eastbound train won't arrive for 3 days," the older man was saying, and Margaret turned at the sound of Samuel's footsteps on the wooden planks. Up close, she was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 24 or 25, with the pale complexion of someone raised indoors and the careful posture of a woman accustomed to carrying herself with dignity despite circumstances. Her eyes were gray like the winter sky, and they studied his face with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. "Ma'am," Samuel said, removing his hat despite the wind that immediately began to toss his dark hair. "I'm Dr. Cross. I couldn't help but notice your situation, and I wanted to offer assistance. The babies sound distressed, and this weather is no place for little ones." Margaret shifted the twins protectively, her arms tightening around the small bodies even as she evaluated this new arrival. "I appreciate your concern, Dr. Cross," she said carefully, "but I don't wish to impose on anyone's kindness. We'll manage somehow." Samuel could see the exhaustion in the set of her shoulders, could hear the slight tremor in her voice that spoke of someone reaching the end of their endurance. One of the babies had begun to cough, a small sound that made his medical training prickle with concern. The other was crying with the particular intensity that usually meant hunger or cold or both. "Those children need to be out of this wind," he said gently. "My clinic is just across the street, and there's a room above it where you could rest for the night.
No obligations, no expectations.
Just shelter until you can decide what to do next." The station master nodded encouragingly. "Dr. Cross is a good man, ma'am. Delivered half the babies in this town and never turned away anyone who needed help, regardless of their ability to pay." Margaret looked between the two men, her mind clearly weighing risks and possibilities. Samuel could see the moment she made her decision, could watch her shoulders square with the resolve of someone who had no choice but to accept help or watch her children suffer. "You're very kind," she said quietly. "I accept your offer gratefully, though I insist this is only temporary. I'll find other arrangements as soon as possible." Samuel picked up her small carpet bag without asking permission, noting its lightness and the way the fabric had been carefully mended in several places. The woman had traveled light, probably because she owned little rather than from any desire for simplicity. He gestured toward his clinic, its windows glowing warmly in the gathering darkness. The wind had picked up considerably by the time they crossed the street, sending snow swirling around them in dizzy spirals that seemed to mock their hurried progress. Samuel pushed open the door to his clinic, feeling the blessed warmth rush out to meet them like an embrace from civilization itself. The main room of the clinic was neat and organized, with glass-fronted cabinets containing bottles of medicine and surgical instruments, and an examination table covered with clean white sheets. A pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated heat throughout the space, and Samuel was gratified to see Margaret move instinctively toward its warmth. "Let me show you upstairs," he said, leading the way to a narrow staircase at the back of the room. The space above had originally been intended for storage, but Samuel had converted it into simple living quarters when he first arrived in Cedar Ridge. It contained a bed, a washstand, a small table with 2 chairs, and most importantly, a smaller stove that kept the space comfortable even on the coldest nights. Margaret stepped into the room and seemed to sag slightly with relief, the warmth and shelter working on her like medicine on a fevered patient. The twins had quieted somewhat, though Samuel could still hear the congestion in their breathing that suggested they were fighting off the effects of their long journey and exposure to the cold. "There's wood for the stove," he said, gesturing toward a neat pile in the corner, "and clean water in the pitcher by the washstand. I'll bring up some soup and bread in a few minutes, and perhaps some warm milk for the babies if they're old enough." Margaret turned to face him, and he saw tears gathering in her gray eyes despite her obvious efforts to maintain composure. "Dr. Cross," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you for this kindness. I had begun to think that perhaps I had made a terrible mistake in coming west." Samuel felt something twist in his chest at the defeat in her voice, recognizing the sound of someone who had been disappointed too many times to hope easily. "We all make mistakes, Mrs. Hayes," he said gently. "The measure of a person isn't in avoiding them, but in how we respond when they occur." He left her to settle the babies and went back downstairs to prepare food, his mind already cataloging the medical supplies he might need if the twins' coughs worsened during the night. Through his clinic windows, he could see the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkling like earthbound stars, each one representing a family gathered around their own hearth, safe from the storm that was building strength outside. Samuel had learned long ago that loneliness could be more dangerous than any disease, more deadly than the worst injury. He had seen what isolation could do to the human spirit, had watched people wither and die not from physical ailments but from the simple absence of human kindness. Tonight, at least, Margaret Hayes and her babies would not face that particular danger. The wind howled around the building like a living thing seeking entry, But inside the clinic, warmth and safety held dominion over the darkness gathering beyond the windows. Margaret woke to the sound of her babies crying and the gray light of dawn filtering through the small window above the bed. For a moment, disorientation clouded her thoughts as she tried to remember where she was, why her body ached from sleeping in unfamiliar surroundings. Then memory rushed back like cold water, bringing with it the sharp recollection of Thomas Whitmore's rejection and Dr. Cross's unexpected kindness. Emma's cries had taken on the urgent quality that meant hunger could no longer be ignored, while James coughed with the congested sound that had worried Margaret throughout the night. She had dozed fitfully, starting awake each time one of the twins stirred, her body attuned to their needs even in exhaustion. The small room was warm from the stove that Dr. Cross had banked before leaving them for the night, but she could hear wind still rattling the windows with winter's persistence. She rose carefully, her muscles protesting after days of travel and a night on the narrow bed. Through the window, she could see that snow had continued falling throughout the night, transforming Cedar Ridge into a landscape of white drifts and crystalline beauty that would have taken her breath away under different circumstances. Now it only emphasized how trapped she had become in this mountain town with no means of escape. Footsteps on the stairs below made her freeze, clutching Emma closer to her chest. A gentle knock preceded Dr. Cross's voice through the thin door. "Mrs. Hayes, I brought some warm milk and porridge if you're awake." Margaret smoothed her hair as best she could and checked that her dress was properly arranged before opening the door. Samuel Cross stood on the narrow landing holding a wooden tray laden with simple fare that looked like a feast to Margaret's hungry eyes. Steam rose from a bowl of thick porridge, and a pitcher of warm milk sat beside a loaf of bread that smelled of yeast and comfort. His dark hair was damp from washing, and he had changed from his previous day's clothes into clean wool trousers and a white shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. "Thank you," she said, accepting the tray with hands that trembled slightly from fatigue and nervousness. "You're very kind to trouble yourself with our needs. I hope we didn't disturb your rest with the baby's fussing during the night." "Not at all," Samuel replied, though Margaret noticed the shadows beneath his eyes that suggested his own sleep had been less than peaceful. "How are the little ones this morning? I heard some coughing that concerned me." "James's chest sounds congested," Margaret admitted, settling back on the bed with Emma while keeping the baby boy close enough for Samuel to examine. "Emma seems better, but they're both hungry and I'm not certain the milk I brought from the train is still good." Samuel approached with the careful movements of someone accustomed to dealing with nervous patients and frightened animals. "May I listen to his breathing?" he asked, producing a wooden stethoscope from his vest pocket. Margaret nodded, watching as he placed the instrument against James's tiny chest with infinite gentleness. The doctor's face remained professionally neutral as he listened, but Margaret caught a flicker of concern in his brown eyes. "It's not pneumonia," he said finally, straightening up, "but there's definitely congestion that needs watching. The journey and cold air have irritated his lungs somewhat. With warmth and proper care, he should improve quickly." Relief flooded through Margaret with such intensity that she felt dizzy. She had lost too much already to bear the thought of losing one of her children to illness in this strange place. "What should I do?" she asked, hearing the desperation she tried so hard to hide creeping into her voice. "Keep him warm and dry," Samuel said, his tone reassuring without being dismissive of her concerns. "I'll prepare a steam treatment that should help clear his breathing, and I have some honey that will soothe his throat. Both babies would benefit from staying indoors for a few days until this weather breaks." Margaret looked toward the window where snow continued to fall with the steady determination of a mountain winter. "A few days." The words echoed in her mind like a sentence rather than a reprieve. "Dr. Cross," she said carefully, "I cannot impose on your hospitality indefinitely. You've already shown us more kindness than we had any right to expect." Samuel was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving from the babies to Margaret's face with an intensity that made her look away. Outside, she could hear the town beginning to stir despite the early hour, the sounds of people starting their daily routines filtering through the walls. Horses nickered in the street below, and somewhere a dog barked at the swirling snow. "Mrs. Hayes," he said finally, "may I ask what your plans are? Do you have family back east who might take you in, or resources that would allow you to establish yourself elsewhere?" The question she had been dreading hung in the air between them like smoke from the stove. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks as she considered how much truth she could afford to reveal to this man who had already done so much for them. "I have some skills," she said carefully. "I can cook and clean, and I have experience caring for the sick. In Boston, I worked for a family as a housekeeper before the babies came. What she did not say was that the family had dismissed her the moment her condition became apparent, that her own parents had turned her away when she had nowhere else to go, that she had spent her last coins on the train ticket west and the mail-order bride correspondence that had brought her to this moment of complete dependence on a stranger's mercy. Samuel seemed to sense the weight of what she was not saying. He stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the snow-covered town. Cedar Ridge could use someone with medical experience, he said thoughtfully. I'm the only doctor for 50 miles, and there are times when I could use assistance, especially with women and children who might feel more comfortable with feminine care. Margaret stared at his back, afraid to hope that he might be offering her a solution to her impossible situation. You mean employment? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I mean that you and your children need a place to stay, and I need help managing my practice, Samuel said, turning back to face her. It would be a practical arrangement, nothing more. You would have your own quarters, of course, and a salary that would allow you to save toward whatever future you choose to build. The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, and Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she considered the implications. To stay in Cedar Ridge would mean facing the judgment of people who had witnessed her public rejection, would mean building a life in a place where she would always be known as the woman Thomas Whitmore had found unworthy. But it would also mean safety for her babies, meaningful work, and the chance to prove that she was more than the shame that had driven her from Boston. She looked down at Emma and James, both of them peaceful now in the warmth of the small room, and felt something that might have been hope beginning to take root in her chest. I would be honored to assist you, Dr. Cross, she said quietly, meeting his eyes with as much dignity as she could muster. Though I should warn you that my presence in your household may cause talk among the townspeople. Samuel's smile was gentle but tinged with something that looked like sadness. Mrs. Hayes, he said, I lost my wife and child 2 years ago, and since then I've learned that people will talk regardless of what we do. The question is whether we let their opinions determine how we live our lives. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the small room above the clinic, Margaret felt the first stirrings of something that might eventually grow into belonging. The blizzard that had been threatening since Margaret's arrival descended upon Cedar Ridge with the fury of a mountain winter unleashed. By mid-morning, snow fell so thickly that the buildings across the street disappeared behind a curtain of white, and the wind howled around the clinic like a living thing seeking entry. Samuel had ventured out once to check on his horse in the small stable behind the building, returning with his coat crusted with ice and his cheeks reddened from the brutal cold. We're well and truly snowed in, he announced, shaking the snow from his coat near the stove downstairs. No one will be moving through the storm for at least 2 days, maybe 3. He looked up toward the ceiling where Margaret had been tending to the twins, his expression thoughtful. I hope you don't mind close quarters, Mrs. Hayes. This storm has a way of making the world very small indeed. Margaret had come to appreciate the strange intimacy that the blizzard imposed upon them. With no patients able to reach the clinic and no possibility of venturing outside, she and Samuel had settled into an unexpected domestic rhythm that felt both foreign and surprisingly natural. She prepared simple meals on the clinic's small stove while he tended to the twins with the patient gentleness that marked his every interaction with those in his care. The babies had improved noticeably under his attention. James's cough had eased after the steam treatments Samuel prepared with herbs from his medical supplies, and both children seemed to thrive in the consistent warmth of the clinic. Margaret found herself watching the doctor as he held Emma, noting the way his large hands supported her small head with infinite care, the soft murmur of his voice as he spoke to her in the nonsensical words that seemed to comfort infants across all languages. You're very good with them, she observed during their second day of confinement, settling beside him at the small table where they shared their meals. Most men seem uncomfortable around babies, especially those that aren't their own. Samuel was quiet for a moment, his thumb stroking Emma's tiny fist where it had wrapped around his finger with the instinctive grip of the very young. My wife and I lost our son when he was just a few days old, he said finally, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone speaking of old pain. Sarah died in childbirth, and the baby followed her 3 days later. I suppose I've wondered sometimes what it would have been like to hold my own child, to see him grow and learn about the world. The simple words contained volumes of grief that Margaret recognized from her own experience of loss. She had lost the man she thought she loved when he abandoned her upon learning of her pregnancy, had lost her family's acceptance, her place in Boston society, her dreams of respectability. But she had gained Emma and James, while Samuel had lost everything and been left with only the echo of what might have been. "I'm sorry," she said softly, meaning it with the depth that only comes from understanding such loss personally. To lose both wife and child must have been devastating beyond words. It was, Samuel admitted, his eyes still fixed on Emma's peaceful face. "For a long time I thought about leaving medicine altogether. How can you heal others when you couldn't save the people who mattered most? But eventually I realized that Sarah would have wanted me to use my skills to help prevent other families from experiencing what we went through." The wind rattled the windows with renewed force, reminding them of the storm raging beyond their small sanctuary of warmth and tentative companionship. Margaret found herself studying Samuel's profile as he continued to hold Emma, noting the strength in his jaw, the gentleness in his eyes, the way his presence seemed to create a sense of safety even in the midst of the mountain's fury. "Is that why you came to Cedar Ridge?" she asked. "To start over somewhere no one knew about your loss?" "Partly," Samuel said, finally looking up to meet her gaze. "But also because frontier towns like this need doctors willing to stay, to become part of the community rather than just passing through. These people face dangers and hardships that city doctors never encounter. They deserve someone who understands their struggles." Margaret felt something shift in her chest at his words, a recognition of the kind of man he was beneath his quiet exterior. He could have chosen to practice in Denver or Colorado Springs, could have surrounded himself with the comfort and society that his education and skills would have afforded him. Instead, he had chosen isolation and hard work in service of people who might never fully appreciate the sacrifice he had made. "That's very noble of you," she said, though the words felt inadequate to express what she was thinking. Samuel shook his head with a slight smile. "Not noble, just practical. Everyone needs a purpose, Mrs. Hayes. Healing others has become mine, and it's served me well enough. But what about you? What brought you west beyond the obvious need for security?" The question touched on territory that Margaret had hoped to avoid, the complicated mix of desperation and hope that had driven her to answer Thomas Whitmore's advertisement. She shifted James to her other arm, using the movement to buy herself time to consider how much truth she was willing to share with this man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. "I wanted a fresh start," she said carefully. "In Boston, I was defined entirely by my mistakes, by the shame of having children without a husband. No matter what I did or how hard I worked, I would always be the woman who had fallen from grace. I thought perhaps in the West, where people are more concerned with survival than propriety, I might have a chance to be judged by my actions rather than my past." Samuel nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his brown eyes. "And instead you found Thomas Whitmore, who judged you more harshly than anyone in Boston might have done." The bitter irony wasn't lost on Margaret. She had traveled 2,000 miles seeking acceptance only to face the cruelest rejection of her life in front of a crowd of strangers. Yet somehow, sitting in this warm clinic with snow piling against the windows and her babies peaceful in her arms, she felt closer to belonging than she had in months. "Perhaps it was a blessing in disguise," she said, surprising herself with the words. "If Mr. Whitmore had accepted us, I never would have met you or discovered that there might be a place for me here in Cedar Ridge." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Margaret and the twins with an expression she couldn't quite read. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain town, but inside the clinic, surrounded by the warmth of the stove and the gentle breathing of sleeping babies, Margaret began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found the fresh start she had been seeking after all. The blizzard that had seemed like another catastrophe was beginning to feel more like providence, trapping them together long enough for trust to take root in the fertile ground of shared vulnerability and mutual need. On the third morning, the storm finally exhausted itself against the mountains, leaving Cedar Ridge buried under drifts that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the returning sunlight. Margaret stood at the clinic window, marveling at how the brutal weather had transformed the rough frontier town into something that belonged in a fairy tale, all soft curves and pristine beauty that masked the harsh realities beneath. Samuel had risen before dawn to dig a path to the stable, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air as he worked to ensure his horse had survived the storm. Margaret watched him through the frost-etched glass, noting the efficient way he moved despite the exhaustion that lined his face. He had spent much of the night tending to James, who had developed a fever that broke just before sunrise, leaving the baby peaceful but weak. The sound of voices in the street drew her attention to the first stirrings of life as the town began to emerge from its enforced hibernation. She could see people opening their doors cautiously, checking on neighbors, beginning the work of digging out from under nature's assault. Soon, patients would begin arriving at the clinic, and the strange intimacy of their storm-bound days would give way to the practical realities of their new arrangement. "Mrs. Hayes," Samuel called from below. "There's someone at the door asking for medical attention. Would you mind bringing down some clean bandages from the supply cabinet?" Margaret gathered the requested supplies and made her way downstairs, finding Samuel examining a middle-aged woman whose hand was wrapped in a blood-soaked cloth. The woman looked up at Margaret's approach, her eyes narrowing with the calculating assessment that seemed to be the specialty of small-town matrons everywhere. "This is Mrs. Hayes," Samuel said without preamble. "She'll be assisting me with patients from now on." "Mrs. Hayes, this is Mrs. Patterson. She cut her hand badly while chopping kindling this morning." Mrs. Patterson's gaze moved pointedly to the twins, who were sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle Samuel had fashioned from a wooden crate and soft blankets. "So you're the woman Thomas Whitmore refused," she said with the bluntness that frontier life seemed to encourage. "Caused quite a stir at the mercantile yesterday, folks discussing whether you were truly as unsuitable as he claimed." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice steady as she began preparing the bandages. "Mr. Whitmore and I were not well suited for each other," she replied diplomatically. "Fortunately, Dr. Cross was kind enough to offer me employment that better matches my abilities." "Employment," Mrs. Patterson repeated, her tone suggesting she found the word suspicious. "Well, I suppose it's none of my business what arrangements people make, though I do hope you understand the importance of maintaining proper appearances in a community like ours." Samuel's hands stilled momentarily in their work, and Margaret caught the flash of irritation that crossed his features before he regained his professional composure. "Mrs. Patterson," he said mildly, "Mrs. Hayes has nursing experience that will benefit everyone in Cedar Ridge. I'm sure you'll find her care most competent should you ever require it. While this quiet mountain cabin feels so peaceful, I'd love to know where you're enjoying this story from and whether it's day or night in your part of the world." The older woman seemed to recognize the subtle warning in Samuel's tone and subsided into uncomfortable silence while he cleaned and stitched her wound with practiced efficiency. Margaret assisted by handing him instruments and holding the woman's arm steady, noting how naturally they worked together despite their brief acquaintance. When Mrs. Patterson left with her hand properly bandaged and instructions for care, she offered a grudging thank you that suggested she might be willing to withhold final judgment for the moment. "She won't be the last to question our arrangement," Samuel said once they were alone again. "Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" Margaret had been asking herself the same question since accepting his offer. In Boston, her fall from grace had been swift and decisive, but here in Cedar Ridge, she would have to earn acceptance day by day, patient by patient, proving her worth through actions rather than words. The prospect was both daunting and oddly liberating. "I've lived under judgment before, Dr. Cross," she said, settling into the chair beside his desk where she had begun organizing his medical records. "The difference here is that I have the chance to influence what people think of me through my work rather than simply enduring their disapproval." Samuel looked up from the notes he was making about Mrs. Patterson's treatment, his brown eyes thoughtful. "You have more courage than you give yourself credit for," he said quietly. "Most people would have fled back east on the first available train rather than face the kind of gossip you're likely to encounter." "Running away was my first instinct," Margaret admitted, glancing toward the twins who were beginning to stir from their nap. "But where would I go? Back to Boston, where my shame follows me like a shadow. To another town where I know no one and have no means of support. At least here I have the opportunity to build something, even if it's difficult." The clinic door opened again, admitting a young man whose leg was obviously causing him significant pain. Samuel rose immediately to assist him, and Margaret found herself naturally falling into the rhythm of helping that she had observed during Mrs. Patterson's visit. She fetched supplies, prepared treatments, and offered comfort to the patient while Samuel worked with the focused intensity that marked his approach to medicine. As the day progressed, a steady stream of people arrived seeking treatment for injuries and ailments that had accumulated during the storm. Margaret quickly discovered that her experience caring for her employer's family in Boston had prepared her better than she had realized for the demands of frontier medicine. She knew how to calm frightened children, how to assist with difficult patients, how to maintain the calm efficiency that medical emergencies required. More importantly, she began to see how her presence changed the dynamic of the clinic. Women who might have been reluctant to seek medical attention from the male doctor seemed more comfortable with another woman present. Children responded to her gentle voice and patient hands. Even the men, initially suspicious of the stranger among them, gradually began to relax as they witnessed her competence. By evening, when the last patient had been treated and sent home, Margaret felt a sense of accomplishment that she had not experienced since before her disgrace in Boston. She had been useful, needed, respected for her abilities rather than judged for her circumstances. The twins had slept peacefully through most of the day, content in their makeshift nursery, and she began to envision how this new life might unfold. Samuel was cleaning his instruments when she finished organizing the medical supplies, the familiar ritual that marked the end of each day's work. "Thank you," he said without looking up from his task. "Having assistance made everything much easier, and I could see that the patients responded well to your presence." Margaret felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the heat from the stove spreading through her chest. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, she began to believe that she might indeed find the fresh start she had been seeking. The path would not be easy, and she would face judgment and suspicion from some quarters, but she had proven to herself and others that she possessed value beyond her past mistakes. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the clear mountain sky, their light reflecting off the snow-covered ground with crystalline beauty. Inside the clinic, surrounded by the tools of healing and the quiet breathing of her sleeping babies, Margaret allowed herself to hope that perhaps belonging was not as impossible as she had once believed. The emergency came on a Tuesday afternoon when the mountain air carried the sharp scent of early spring, and the first tentative signs of thaw appeared along the clinic's southern wall. Margaret was cataloging Samuel's medical supplies when the frantic pounding on the door shattered the peaceful quiet that had settled over Cedar Ridge like a comfortable blanket. Samuel opened the door to find Bill Morrison, his face pale with terror, clutching his young daughter against his chest. The child, perhaps 7 years old, hung limp in his arms, her breathing shallow and labored, her skin bearing the grayish pallor that Margaret had learned to recognize as a sign of serious illness. "Doc," Bill gasped, his voice breaking with desperation. "It's Lucy. She was playing by the creek this morning. Fell through the ice. We got her out quick, but she's been getting worse all day. Can't seem to get warm, can't catch her breath proper." Samuel took the child immediately, his trained hands assessing her condition with the swift efficiency that marked all his medical evaluations. Margaret cleared the examination table without being asked, her mind already cataloging the supplies they might need. The child's lips had a blue tinge that spoke of inadequate circulation, and her small body shivered with tremors that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere cold. "How long was she in the water?" Samuel asked, his fingers checking the pulse points at Lucy's throat and wrists, while Margaret began stoking the fire to raise the room's temperature. "Maybe 3 minutes," Bill replied, his hands shaking as he watched Samuel work. "Seemed like hours, but my wife thinks it was 3 minutes at most. She started breathing again once we got her out, but she hasn't been right since." Margaret moved closer to the table, studying the child's condition with the focused attention that medical crises demanded. Lucy's breathing was rapid and shallow, her skin cold to the touch despite the blankets her father had wrapped around her. But it was the child's eyes that concerned Margaret most, the way they seemed unfocused, as if she were seeing something beyond the present moment. "Dr. Cross," Margaret said quietly, drawing his attention to Lucy's dilated pupils. "I think there may be more than hypothermia at work here. In Boston, I helped care for a child who had nearly drowned in the harbor. The symptoms were similar." Samuel followed her gaze and nodded grimly. "Water in the lungs," he confirmed. "Even a small amount can cause problems hours after the initial incident." He turned to Bill with the gentle authority that helped him deliver difficult news to frightened families. "We need to keep Lucy warm and help her body clear the fluid from her lungs. It's going to be a long night, but children are remarkably resilient." Margaret found herself taking charge of the warming treatments while Samuel prepared medications to help clear Lucy's breathing. She heated stones by the fire and wrapped them in cloth to place around the child's body, careful to avoid burns while providing the steady heat that hypothermia victims required. Her movements were sure and practiced, drawing on knowledge she had gained through necessity during her years caring for others. As the afternoon wore into evening, Lucy's condition remained precarious. Her breathing improved slightly with the warming treatments, but the fluid in her lungs continued to cause distressing episodes where she would gasp and struggle for air. Margaret stayed by the child's side, monitoring her breathing, adjusting the warming stones, speaking in the low, soothing tones that seemed to calm patients even in their distress. Bill Morrison paced the clinic like a caged animal, his fear palpable in the small space. His wife arrived as darkness fell, bringing with her the quiet strength that frontier women developed through necessity. She took one look at Margaret tending to her daughter and settled into the chair beside the examination table without question or complaint. "You're very good with her," Mrs. Morrison said quietly, watching as Margaret gently repositioned the child to help her breathing. "Lucy's always been shy around strangers, but she seems peaceful with you." Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her throat at the woman's words. Children had always responded well to her care, perhaps sensing the maternal instincts that had been awakened by her own baby's needs. "I have experience with little ones," she replied simply, not trusting herself to say more without revealing the depth of emotion the situation stirred in her. Samuel emerged from his supply cabinet with a bottle of liquid medication that would help reduce the inflammation in Lucy's lungs. As he prepared the dose, Margaret noticed the careful precision of his movements, the way his hands remained steady despite the gravity of the situation. This was a man who had learned to channel his emotions into healing action, who had transformed his own grief into a tool for preventing others from experiencing similar loss. The critical moment came near midnight when Lucy's breathing suddenly became more labored and her lips took on an alarming blue tinge. Margaret was beside her instantly, tilting the child's head to clear her airway while Samuel prepared emergency treatments. For several terrifying minutes, it seemed as though they might lose her, but gradually, with careful intervention and constant monitoring, Lucy's breathing began to stabilize. By dawn, the crisis had passed. Lucy's color had returned to normal, her breathing was clear and steady, and she had awakened long enough to ask for her mother in a voice that was weak but unmistakably alive. Bill Morrison wept openly as he held his daughter, his gratitude toward Samuel and Margaret expressed in words that seemed inadequate to the magnitude of his relief. "You saved her life," he said to Margaret as they prepared to take Lucy home for continued rest. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. The way you knew exactly what she needed, how to keep her comfortable through the worst of it. You're a natural healer, ma'am." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched the Morrison family leave the clinic, Lucy wrapped in blankets and carried carefully in her father's arms. The child would recover completely, would grow up to have a full life because of the intervention they had provided during her darkest hours. Samuel was cleaning his instruments when Margaret finally allowed herself to acknowledge the magnitude of what had transpired. They had saved a life together, had worked as a team with the kind of intuitive understanding that usually took years to develop. She had proven to herself and to the community that her value extended far beyond her past mistakes, that she possessed skills and instincts that could make a real difference in people's lives. "You were remarkable tonight," Samuel said, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to reach deep into her chest. "I've worked with trained nurses who couldn't have handled that situation with half your competence and compassion." Margaret looked around the clinic that had become her sanctuary, at the twins sleeping peacefully in their makeshift nursery, at the man who had given her the chance to discover capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, she began to believe that she might not only survive in this mountain town but truly thrive, building a life based on service and skill rather than shame and desperation. Outside, the first light of dawn was painting the snow-covered peaks with shades of rose and gold, promising another day of possibilities in the place she was slowly learning to call home. Word of Lucy Morrison's recovery spread through Cedar Ridge with the speed that only small communities could achieve, carrying with it a transformation in how the townspeople viewed the woman who had arrived as an unwanted mail-order bride and was slowly becoming an indispensable part of their mountain settlement. Margaret found herself greeted with nods of respect rather than whispers of speculation when she accompanied Samuel on his rounds, and mothers began specifically requesting her presence when their children required medical attention. The change was perhaps most evident in the way Mrs. Patterson, who had initially questioned Margaret's propriety, now sought her out for advice about her arthritic hands and spoke of her with grudging admiration to anyone who would listen. Margaret had become living proof that a person's worth could not be measured by their past mistakes but only by their willingness to serve others with skill and compassion. Samuel watched this transformation with something that looked remarkably like pride, though he was careful never to express it directly. Instead, he found himself creating opportunities for Margaret to demonstrate her abilities, asking her opinion on difficult cases, deferring to her judgment when it came to treating women and children. Their partnership had evolved into something that felt both professional and deeply personal, built on mutual respect and the kind of understanding that developed between people who had faced crisis together. On a warm afternoon in late March, when the snow had finally begun its reluctant retreat from the lower elevations and the twins were thriving in their makeshift nursery, Margaret was organizing medical supplies when she became aware of a familiar presence in the clinic doorway. She looked up to find Thomas Whitmore standing there, his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that she couldn't quite interpret. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice carrying none of the harsh judgment that had marked their first encounter. "I wonder if I might have a word with you. There are things that need to be said, apologies that need to be made." Margaret felt her spine stiffen involuntarily, the memory of his public rejection still sharp enough to cause pain. Samuel emerged from his office at the sound of voices, his expression becoming carefully neutral when he saw who their visitor was. The tension in the small space was palpable, charged with the weight of unfinished business and unresolved hurt. "Mr. Whitmore," Margaret said quietly, maintaining the dignity that had carried her through their previous encounter. "What brings you to the clinic today? Are you in need of medical attention?" Whitmore shifted uncomfortably, his gaze moving between Margaret and Samuel before settling on some point beyond the window. "I've been hearing stories," he said slowly, "about how you saved Bill Morrison's little girl, about the way you've been helping folks around town. People are saying you're a natural healer, that Dr. Cross couldn't ask for better assistance." "I do what I can to help," Margaret replied carefully, unsure where this conversation was leading but unwilling to make it easy for the man who had caused her such public humiliation. Thomas cleared his throat, his discomfort evident in every line of his body. "The thing is, Mrs. Hayes, I may have been too hasty in my judgment when you first arrived. I was expecting one thing and found another, and I let my disappointment cloud my thinking. A man in my position can't afford to appear weak, but I realize now that my actions may have been unnecessarily harsh." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach as she began to understand what Thomas was suggesting. Samuel stepped closer, his presence protective without being obvious, and she drew strength from his proximity as she considered how to respond to this unexpected development. "Mr. Whitmore," she said finally, "I appreciate your acknowledgement of the difficulties surrounding our first meeting. However, I'm not certain what you're hoping to accomplish with this conversation." "What I'm hoping," Thomas said, his voice gaining strength as he moved into more familiar territory, "is that we might reconsider our arrangement. You've proven yourself to be a woman of substance and capability, and I was wrong to judge you so quickly. Perhaps we could start fresh, put the unpleasantness behind us and move forward with the original plan." The silence that followed his words seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with the weight of implications and possibilities that Margaret had never expected to face. She was aware of Samuel's stillness beside her, could feel the tension radiating from him, though his expression remained professionally composed. Outside, the sound of spring runoff could be heard as snow melted and ran in rivulets toward the creek that wound through the heart of Cedar Ridge. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Whitmore," Margaret said carefully, "while our characters find warmth by the fire. Tell me in the comments what time it is where you are and what's keeping you warm tonight. But I'm afraid circumstances have changed considerably since our original correspondence. I found meaningful work here with Dr. Cross, and my children have settled into a routine that serves them well." Thomas's expression darkened slightly, and Margaret caught a glimpse of the man who had rejected her so publicly on the train platform. "Surely you can't prefer the uncertain position of a hired assistant to the security of marriage and your own household," he said, his tone suggesting he found such a preference incomprehensible. Samuel finally spoke, his voice carefully modulated but carrying an underlying steel that made Thomas take a step backward. "Mrs. Hayes has proven invaluable to this clinic and to the people of Cedar Ridge," he said quietly. "Any decision about her future must naturally rest with her, but I would hate to lose such a capable assistant." Margaret felt a flutter of something that might have been gratitude or relief or perhaps something deeper at Samuel's words. She looked at Thomas Whitmore, this man who had once represented her only hope for security and respectability, and realized that his offer no longer held any appeal for her. The woman who had stepped off the train weeks ago, desperate and afraid, had been replaced by someone stronger, someone who had found her worth through service rather than marriage. "Mr. Whitmore," she said with quiet finality, "I'm honored by your reconsideration, but I must decline your offer. I found my place here in Dr. Cross's clinic, and I have no desire to change my circumstances. I wish you well in finding a wife who will better suit your needs and expectations." Thomas stood for a moment longer, his expression cycling through surprise, disappointment, and finally a grudging respect. "Very well, Mrs. Hayes," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "I can't say I understand your choice, but I respect your right to make it. You've certainly proven that you're not the helpless woman I initially took you for." After he left, Margaret and Samuel stood in the quiet clinic, the weight of what had just transpired settling around them like dust after a windstorm. Margaret felt a strange sense of completion, as if a chapter of her life had finally closed, allowing her to move forward without the shadow of might-have-beens clouding her vision. "You turned down security for uncertainty," Samuel observed, though his tone suggested approval rather than criticism. Margaret looked around the clinic that had become her sanctuary, at the twins who were beginning to stir from their afternoon nap, at the man who had given her the chance to discover her own strength. "I turned down a life that would have required me to diminish myself for one that allows me to grow," she said simply. Outside, the mountain spring continued its work of renewal, melting away the last remnants of winter and preparing the ground for whatever new growth the coming season might bring. The confrontation came on a morning when spring had finally claimed victory over winter, when the air carried the scent of pine and wet earth and the promise of renewal that the mountain seasons brought to Cedar Ridge. Margaret was preparing herbal remedies in the clinic's back room when she heard raised voices in the main area, followed by Samuel's carefully controlled tone, attempting to defuse whatever situation had developed. She emerged to find 3 men she didn't recognize standing near the entrance, their travel-stained clothes and aggressive postures marking them as strangers with business that had brought them far from whatever place they called home. The largest of the group, a man with a scarred face and cold eyes, was speaking to Samuel with the kind of forced politeness that barely concealed underlying threats. "We're looking for a woman named Margaret Hayes," the man was saying, his gaze sweeping the clinic with calculating assessment. "We have reason to believe she might be found in this establishment. Perhaps you could save us all some trouble by producing her without delay." Samuel's posture had shifted subtly, his medical bag positioned within easy reach and his body angled to protect both Margaret and the twins from whatever danger these men represented. "I'm Dr. Cross," he said evenly. "This is a medical clinic. If you're seeking treatment for injuries or illness, I'm happy to assist you. Otherwise, I'll have to ask you to state your business clearly." The scarred man smiled with no warmth whatever, his attention fixing on Margaret with the intensity of a predator recognizing its prey. "There she is," he said with satisfaction. "Margaret Hayes, by order of the Boston Municipal Court, you're wanted for questioning regarding debts and obligations left unpaid when you fled the city without proper notification to your creditors." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face, as the nightmare she had hoped to leave behind in Boston reached across 2,000 miles to find her in this mountain sanctuary. The man was lying, she knew, because she had left no debts unpaid, but the authority he claimed to represent was real enough, and the threat implicit in his presence was unmistakable. "I'm afraid there's been some mistake," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I left Boston with all my obligations properly settled. I have no outstanding debts to any creditors, and no legal proceedings were pending when I departed." The second man, younger but no less menacing, produced a folded document from his coat pocket. "This warrant suggests otherwise, ma'am," he said with mock courtesy. "It authorizes us to escort you back to Boston to answer questions about your sudden departure and the suspicious circumstances surrounding your employment with the Carmichael family." Samuel stepped forward, his professional authority lending weight to his words. "Gentlemen, I'll need to examine any legal documents before allowing them to be served in my clinic. As a physician, I'm responsible for the welfare of my patients and staff, and I won't permit anyone to be removed from my care without proper verification of authority." The scarred man's facade of politeness began to crack, revealing the crude violence that Margaret suspected lay just beneath the surface. "Doc," he said with dangerous quiet, "we didn't come here to debate the finer points of legal procedure. The woman is coming with us one way or another. The only question is whether this goes easy or hard." Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that these men had no legal authority whatever, that they were probably bounty hunters or worse, sent by someone in Boston who had reasons of their own for wanting her returned. Her mind raced through possibilities, trying to understand who might have such interest in her whereabouts and why they would go to such lengths to retrieve her. The twins chose that moment to wake from their nap, their cries adding another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. Margaret's maternal instincts warred with her need to protect herself, but Samuel moved smoothly to intercept her path toward the babies, his message clear without words. "Those children are under my medical care," he said firmly, recovering them from their makeshift nursery with movements that kept his body between the strangers and both Margaret and the babies. Any attempt to remove their mother would constitute interference with ongoing medical treatment, which I cannot permit. The third man, who had remained silent until now, spoke with the kind of educated accent that suggested he was the leader of this group despite his deceptively mild appearance. Dr. Cross, he said reasonably, we understand your concern for your patients, but legal obligations supersede medical considerations. The woman will be returning to Boston with us today, and the children will naturally accompany her. Margaret felt trap closing around her with the inexorable pressure of a mountain avalanche. She had found safety and purpose in Cedar Ridge, had begun to build the life she had dreamed of during her desperate flight from Boston, and now it seemed that even here, in this remote corner of Colorado territory, the past had found her with devastating efficiency. Samuel's jaw tightened as he assessed the situation, his medical training warring with protective instincts that seemed to surprise him with their intensity. These men were clearly prepared to use force if necessary, and the clinic offered little in the way of defensible positions or escape routes. But Margaret could see him calculating odds, considering options, preparing to fight for her safety regardless of the personal cost. Gentlemen, Margaret said quietly, stepping forward to prevent the violence she could feel building in the small space. If you'll allow me a few moments to gather my belongings and make arrangements for the baby's care, I'll come with you willingly. There's no need for unpleasantness that might disturb the other patients. The relief on the strangers' faces was immediately replaced by wariness, as if her cooperation was more suspicious than resistance would have been. The educated leader nodded slowly, but his hand remained close to the weapon Margaret could see outlined beneath his coat. You have 5 minutes, he said, but understand that any attempt to signal for help or delay our departure will result in consequences for everyone in this building. Samuel's eyes met Margaret's across the small space, and she could see the same desperate calculation taking place behind his controlled expression. They both knew that once she left Cedar Ridge with these men, the chances of her returning were virtually non-existent. Whatever waited for her in Boston, it was nothing good, and the life she had begun to build here would be destroyed as thoroughly as if it had never existed. But the twins were here, and Samuel was here, and she would not see either harmed for her sake. The woman who had stepped off the train months ago as a desperate bride might have collapsed under the weight of this new crisis. But the woman who had saved Lucy Morrison's life and earned the respect of Cedar Ridge had resources she was only beginning to discover. Dr. Cross, she said formally, thank you for all your kindness. Please see that my children are properly cared for until I can make arrangements for their future. I trust your judgment completely in all medical matters. The words were carefully chosen, carrying meanings that she hoped Samuel would understand even as they seemed to accept defeat. She had learned much about healing during her time in the clinic, but she had also learned about fighting for things that mattered, about the kind of courage that came not from the absence of fear but from choosing to act despite it. Outside, the spring morning continued its work of renewal, but inside the clinic, winter had returned with a vengeance that threatened to destroy everything Margaret had worked to build in her new life. Margaret moved toward the back room to gather her few possessions, her mind racing through the coded message she had tried to convey to Samuel. The twins' sudden crying had not been coincidence but opportunity, and she prayed that the doctor's sharp intelligence would decipher her meaning before it was too late. Behind her, she could hear the strangers speaking in low tones, their confidence growing as their mission appeared to near successful completion. The small carpetbag that had accompanied her from Boston sat where she had left it weeks ago. A relic of the desperate woman she had been before Cedar Ridge transformed her understanding of her own capabilities. She packed quickly but deliberately, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins like ice water. Through the thin wall, she could hear Samuel speaking to someone who had apparently just entered the clinic, his voice carrying the particular tone of authority he used during medical emergencies. Mrs. Morrison, his voice carried clearly, thank you for bringing Lucy in for her follow-up examination. I believe Mrs. Hayes would like to see how well the child is recovering before she departs on her journey. Margaret felt a flutter of desperate hope as she recognized the signal Samuel was sending. Mary Morrison was not scheduled for any appointment, which meant her presence was anything but coincidental. The doctor was calling in reinforcements, using the network of relationships that small communities depended upon for survival in times of crisis. The sound of more voices filtering through the clinic walls confirmed Margaret's growing optimism. Bill Morrison's deep baritone joined his wife's higher tones, followed by other familiar voices that spoke of neighbors who had found reasons to visit the clinic at precisely this moment. Samuel was mobilizing Cedar Ridge itself in defense of the woman who had saved their children and earned their respect through service and sacrifice. When Margaret emerged from the back room with her bag, she found the clinic's main area had been transformed into something resembling a town meeting. The Morrison family occupied the chairs near Samuel's desk, while Mrs. Patterson stood by the window with her arms crossed in a posture that suggested she had appointed herself guardian of community morals. 3 other townspeople had positioned themselves strategically around the room, their presence casual but their attention focused entirely on the strangers who had come to claim Margaret. The scarred leader looked decidedly less confident than he had moments before, his gaze moving uneasily between the assembled townspeople and the door that no longer offered clear access to escape. His companions had edged closer together, their hands moving instinctively toward concealed weapons that would be of little use against an entire community aroused to protective anger. "Gentlemen," Bill Morrison said with the deceptive mildness that marked dangerous men who had learned to control their tempers, "I couldn't help but overhear that you have business with Mrs. Hayes. As someone whose daughter owes her life to this woman's skill and dedication, I'm naturally curious about the nature of your concerns." The educated leader attempted to regain control of the situation, producing his forged document with a flourish that had lost much of its effectiveness. "We have legal authority to escort Mrs. Hayes back to Boston to answer questions about her sudden departure," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "This is a matter for the courts, not for local interference." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward with the formidable presence that had cowed generations of Cedar Ridge residents into proper behavior. "Young man," she said in tones that brooked no argument, "Mrs. Hayes has been a model citizen of this community since her arrival. She has attended the sick, comforted the dying, and saved at least one child's life that I know of personally. If Boston has questions about her character, they can send someone with proper credentials and references from people we trust." Margaret watched this defense of her character with emotions that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. These people, who had initially viewed her with suspicion and judgment, were now risking their own safety to protect her from men who represented unknown but clearly dangerous interests. The belonging she had sought so desperately was manifesting itself in the most unexpected and moving way possible. Samuel moved to stand beside her, his presence both protective and supportive. "Mrs. Hayes," he said formally, "has been under my professional care since her arrival in Cedar Ridge. As her physician, I cannot recommend travel at this time, particularly not under circumstances that might prove stressful to her continued recovery." The strangers were clearly unprepared for organized community resistance to what they had assumed would be a simple extraction. Their mission had depended upon intimidation and the isolation of their target, neither of which was possible in the face of Cedar Ridge's collective determination to protect one of their own. "Now see here," the scarred man began, his frustration finally overcoming his attempt at civilized discourse, but his words were cut short by the arrival of Sheriff Tom Bradley, whose badge and stern expression left no doubt about his authority or his intentions. "Sheriff," the educated leader said quickly, attempting to salvage his mission through official channels, "we have legal documents authorizing us to take custody of this woman for transport back to Boston. Perhaps you could assist us in carrying out this lawful order." Tom Bradley was a man who had survived 20 years of frontier law enforcement by developing an excellent sense for distinguishing between legitimate authority and elaborate deception. He examined the proffered document with the careful attention of someone who had seen every variety of forged paper that criminal creativity could devise. "This warrant appears to have some irregularities," he said finally, his voice carrying the flat certainty of professional judgment. "The seals don't match any I've seen from Boston courts, and the language seems more suited to territorial rather than municipal law. I'm afraid I'll have to telegraph the Boston authorities for verification before I can recognize this as legitimate." The 3 strangers exchanged glances that spoke of plans rapidly unraveling and missions that could not afford the scrutiny that official verification would bring. Margaret realized that Samuel's mobilization of the community had done more than provide her with protection. It had exposed the fraudulent nature of her pursuers' claims and forced them into a position where continued deception was impossible. The scarred leader made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "Sheriff," he said with diminishing authority, "we've traveled a long way on legitimate business. Surely you can't intend to harbor a fugitive from justice simply because she's gained the sympathy of local residents." Sheriff Bradley's smile was not pleasant to witness. "Stranger," he replied, "I don't intend to harbor anyone from legitimate justice. But I also don't intend to let anyone be taken from my jurisdiction by men whose credentials won't stand up to basic examination. You gentlemen are welcome to remain in Cedar Ridge while I verify your authority. But Mrs. Hayes stays right here until I'm satisfied about the truth of this situation." Margaret felt tears of relief and gratitude threatening to overflow as she realized that the community she had served had chosen to serve her in return, that the belonging she had yearned for had become real enough to provide actual protection against the forces that sought to destroy her newfound life. Outside, the spring afternoon continued its work of renewal, and inside the clinic, surrounded by people who had chosen to call her friend, Margaret began to believe that perhaps some battles could indeed be won through the simple power of human decency standing together against deception and cruelty. The three strangers left Cedar Ridge before sunset, their departure as swift and furtive as their arrival had been bold and threatening. Sheriff Bradley had made it clear that any further harassment of Margaret would result in charges being filed against them for fraud and intimidation, and his reputation for following through on such promises was well established throughout the Colorado Territory. Margaret watched from the clinic window as they rode away, their figures growing smaller against the backdrop of mountains that had become her sanctuary and home. The townspeople who had rallied to her defense began to disperse as the immediate crisis passed, but not before each had stopped to speak with her personally. Bill Morrison gripped her hands with calloused fingers that trembled slightly with residual anger, telling her that anyone who threatened the woman who had saved his daughter would answer to him personally. Mrs. Patterson, in a gesture that surprised everyone including herself, embraced Margaret with fierce protectiveness and declared that Cedar Ridge took care of its own, regardless of where they had come from originally. Samuel closed the clinic early that evening, hanging the sign that indicated he was not receiving patients except for genuine emergencies. The events of the day had left them both emotionally drained, and the twins sensed the lingering tension in their mother's voice and touch, fussing restlessly despite her attempts to soothe them with lullabies and gentle rocking. "They're picking up on your distress," Samuel observed, settling into the chair across from where Margaret sat with Emma in her arms. "Children have an uncanny ability to sense when their parents are troubled, even when we think we're hiding it successfully." Margaret looked down at her daughter's flushed face, noting the way the baby's eyes seemed to search hers for reassurance that the world remained safe and predictable. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if you hadn't acted so quickly," she said quietly. "If the community hadn't come together the way it did, those men would have taken us, and no one would have known what became of us." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on James, who had finally settled into peaceful sleep in his makeshift cradle. "The thought of losing you both," he said finally, his voice carrying an emotion that made Margaret look up sharply, "was more frightening than I expected it to be. Somewhere in these past months, you and the twins have become essential to my sense of what makes life worth living." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither had dared to voice during the crisis of establishing Margaret's place in the community. She felt her heart begin to race as she recognized the shift in their relationship from professional partnership to something far more personal and precious. "Samuel," she said carefully, unsure how to navigate this new territory without risking the friendship and mutual respect they had built so carefully. "You've been so kind to us, given us safety and purpose when we had nothing. I don't want you to feel obligated to us out of gratitude or pity." He rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside hers, his hands covering the ones she had wrapped protectively around Emma. "Margaret," he said with quiet intensity, "what I feel for you has nothing to do with obligation or pity. You've brought life back into this clinic, into this town, into my own heart in ways I didn't think were possible after Sarah died. Watching you with patience, seeing your courage in the face of danger, witnessing the way you've transformed yourself from a frightened refugee into a woman of strength and purpose, I've fallen in love with who you are, not with what you need." Margaret felt tears gathering in her eyes as she processed words she had never dared to hope she might hear. "This quiet mountain cabin feels so peaceful. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this story from and whether it's day or night in your part of the world." After the abandonment and rejection she had experienced in Boston, after Thomas Whitmore's cruel dismissal, the idea that someone could love her not despite her circumstances but because of how she had risen to meet them seemed almost too wonderful to believe. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I've been afraid to acknowledge it, even to myself, because I couldn't bear the thought of losing what we have if you didn't return my feelings." Samuel's smile was gentle and transformative, erasing the lines of grief and loneliness that had marked his features since she had first met him. "Then marry me," he said simply, "not because you need security or because I need an assistant, but because we've found something together that neither of us expected and both of us deserve." Margaret looked around the clinic that had become home, at the twins who were finally sleeping peacefully, at the man who had seen her at her most desperate and had offered not charity but opportunity, not pity but partnership. The woman who had arrived in Cedar Ridge seeking a marriage of convenience had discovered instead the possibility of a union based on love, respect, and shared purpose. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Yes, I'll marry you, Samuel Cross, and spend the rest of my life proving worthy of the faith you've shown in me. Emma stirred in her arms as if sensing the momentous nature of the conversation taking place around her, and Margaret realized that her daughter would grow up in a household where she was not a burden to be endured but a blessing to be cherished. James would know from his earliest memories that he belonged somewhere, that he was wanted and valued not despite his origins but simply because he existed. The challenges that had seemed insurmountable when Margaret first stepped off the train now appeared as obstacles that had been overcome rather than barriers that would forever define her life. She had found work that utilized her skills, a community that respected her contributions, and a man who loved her not for what she could provide, but for who she had chosen to become. Samuel reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a simple gold band that Margaret recognized as having belonged to his late wife. "Sarah would have wanted you to have this," he said gently, slipping the ring onto Margaret's finger where it fit as if it had been made for her. She always believed that love was meant to heal rather than possess, to build rather than diminish those it touched. Margaret studied the ring that symbolized not replacement but continuation, not competition with Samuel's past but partnership in building their future. The gold caught the lamplight and threw tiny reflections around the room, seeming to bless the space where they had found each other and the life they would build together. Outside, the Colorado evening painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, and spring continued its ancient work of renewal and growth. Inside the CL, Inuk, surrounded by the tools of healing and the quiet breathing of sleeping babies, two people who had known loss and loneliness began to plan a future built on the strongest foundation possible. Love that had grown from friendship, respect that had been earned through service, and hope that had been tested by adversity and proven genuine. The woman who had arrived as an unwanted mail-order bride had become something far more precious. A beloved partner in the work of healing both bodies and hearts in a mountain town that had learned to treasure the gifts that arrived in unexpected packages. The wedding took place on a Saturday morning in early May when the mountain wildflowers had begun their annual celebration of spring's triumph over winter's harsh reign. Margaret had initially suggested a simple ceremony at the courthouse in the next county, but Cedar Ridge would hear nothing of such plans. The community that had defended her against false accusers now insisted on celebrating her transformation from outcast to beloved member of their mountain family. Mrs. Patterson appointed herself coordinator of the festivities with the same determination she had once brought to questioning Margaret's propriety. The older woman seemed to view the wedding as vindication of her eventual acceptance of the newcomer, and she threw herself into the preparations with an energy that surprised everyone who knew her typically reserved nature. She organized the women of Cedar Ridge into committees responsible for food, decorations, and ensuring that Margaret had a wedding dress worthy of the occasion. The dress itself was a marvel of community cooperation, sewn from white silk that Mrs. Morrison had been saving for her own daughter's eventual wedding, with lace contributed by 3 different households and pearl buttons that had belonged to the sheriff's late mother. Margaret tried it on in the back room of the clinic while Emma and James napped peacefully in their cradle, and she felt tears gather in her eyes as she recognized the love that had gone into every stitch. "You look beautiful," Samuel said when she emerged to show him the finished garment, his voice carrying the wonder of a man who still could not quite believe his good fortune. "But more than that, you look happy in a way I've never seen before." Margaret studied her reflection in the small mirror that hung beside Samuel's washstand, noting how the woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the desperate creature who had stepped off the train those months ago. Her face had filled out slightly with regular meals and security, her eyes held confidence rather than fear, and her posture spoke of someone who knew her own worth and had found others who recognized it as well. "I am happy," she admitted, reaching out to touch Samuel's hand where it rested on the examination table they had pushed aside to make room for the dress fitting. "For the first time in my adult life, I'm exactly where I belong, doing work that matters, surrounded by people who value what I have to offer." The ceremony itself was held in the clinic, the space where Margaret had first found refuge, and where she and Samuel had discovered their partnership transformed into the place where they would begin their married life together. Sheriff Bradley had agreed to perform the service, his official capacity lending proper legal weight to their union, while his personal friendship added warmth to the formal proceedings. The entire population of Cedar Ridge seemed to have crowded into the small building, with children sitting on the floor and adults standing along the walls in a testament to the affection Margaret had earned through her service to their community. Bill Morrison held James during the ceremony while his wife cradled Emma, the symbolism of community support extending to the care of Margaret's children during this momentous transition. Samuel had chosen to wear his best suit, the one he reserved for the most serious medical emergencies and the occasional funeral. But Margaret thought he had never looked more handsome than he did standing beside her in the morning light that streamed through the clinic windows. His hands were steady as he spoke his vows, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the crowded room, as he promised to love and cherish not only Margaret but the children she brought to their union. Margaret's own vows came from the heart rather than from any prescribed text, her words expressing gratitude for the second chance she had been given and her commitment to building a life worthy of the trust Samuel and the community had placed in her. She promised to be a partner in his work, a mother to any children they might have together, and a contributing member of the Cedar Ridge community for as long as they would have her. When Sheriff Bradley pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that arose from the assembled townspeople seemed to shake the very foundations of the clinic. Margaret found herself passed from embrace to embrace, receiving congratulations and blessings from people who had witnessed her journey from rejected mail-order bride to respected healer and beloved neighbor. The celebration continued outside, where tables had been set up in the street and laden with food that represented the best efforts of every household in Cedar Ridge. There was roasted venison that the Morrison men had hunted specifically for the occasion, fresh bread baked by Mrs. Patterson using her carefully hoarded white flour, and wildflower honey that the local beekeeper had donated despite its precious rarity so far from civilization. Margaret moved through the crowd with Samuel at her side, accepting good wishes and feeling overwhelmed by the genuine affection being showered upon them. These people had seen her at her lowest point, had witnessed her desperate arrival and gradual transformation, and now they were celebrating not just her wedding but her complete integration into their mountain community. As the afternoon wore on and the festivities began to wind down, Margaret found herself standing with Samuel at the edge of the gathering, watching as neighbors helped clean up and children played games among the scattered chairs and tables. The twins were being passed from person to person, each adult in the community taking a turn holding and cooing over the babies who had been part of Cedar Ridge's story from Margaret's first desperate night in the clinic. "Look at them," Samuel said softly, his arm around Margaret's waist as they observed Emma gurgling happily in Mrs. Patterson's arms while James dozed contentedly against Bill Morrison's broad chest. "They'll grow up knowing they belong here, that they're valued and wanted by everyone in this community." Margaret felt the truth of his words settle into her heart like a benediction. Her children would never know the shame and rejection that had marked her own young adulthood. They would be raised in a place where their mother was respected, where their stepfather was beloved, where the circumstances of their birth mattered far less than the contributions they would make to the community that had embraced them. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountain peaks when the last of the wedding guests finally departed, leaving Margaret and Samuel alone in their clinic with the twins and the scattered remnants of their celebration. They worked together to restore order to the space that served as both their home and their workplace, moving with the practiced efficiency of partners who had learned to anticipate each other's needs and rhythms. When the last dish had been washed and the furniture returned to its proper positions, Margaret found herself standing in the doorway between the clinic proper and the living quarters above, looking back at the room where so much of her transformation had taken place. Here she had learned to assist with medical procedures, had proven her worth to skeptical patients, had found the courage to reject Thomas Whitmore's belated offer and choose her own path forward. Samuel joined her in the doorway, his hands resting gently on her shoulders, as they both contemplated the space that had witnessed their journey from strangers to partners to husband and wife. Tomorrow they would return to their work of healing the sick and injured, but tonight they would celebrate the healing of their own wounded hearts and the beginning of a future built on love that had grown from respect, partnership, and shared purpose. Outside, the Colorado night settled over Cedar Ridge with the peaceful quiet that marked the end of perfect days. And inside the clinic that had become home, two people who had found each other against all odds prepared to begin the next chapter of their story together. 1 year later, Margaret stood at the same clinic window where she had once watched strangers threaten to destroy the life she was building. But now her gaze took in a scene of such contentment that it seemed impossible to believe it was the same place where her desperate journey had begun. The Colorado autumn had painted the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson, and the town of Cedar Ridge bustled with the activity of people preparing for another winter with the confidence that came from knowing they were part of a community that took care of its own. Emma and James, now toddling with the unsteady determination of children just discovering their independence, played on a blanket near Samuel's desk while he examined a patient who had come in with a minor injury sustained while chopping wood for the approaching cold season. The twins had grown into healthy, laughing children who knew no strangers in Cedar Ridge, who were claimed as honorary grandchildren by half the town's residents, and who would grow up secure in the knowledge that they belonged exactly where they were. Margaret's hand moved instinctively to rest on the gentle swell of her belly, where the child she and Samuel had created together grew with each passing day. The pregnancy had been a source of wonder and joy rather than shame and fear, announced to a community that greeted the news with genuine celebration and immediately began planning for the newest addition to their mountain family. This child would know from birth what Margaret had spent years searching for: the certainty of being wanted, valued, and loved without condition. The morning brought its usual parade of patients seeking treatment for ailments both serious and trivial, but Margaret had learned to find deep satisfaction in the rhythm of frontier medicine. She could now assist Samuel with even the most complex procedures, could diagnose common ailments independently, and had earned the trust of women throughout the territory who requested her specifically when medical care was needed during childbirth or family emergencies. Mrs. Patterson arrived just before noon, her arthritic hands wrapped in the special liniment Margaret had developed using herbs gathered from the mountain meadows. The older woman had become one of Margaret's staunchest supporters, never failing to remind anyone who would listen that she had recognized Margaret's worth from the very beginning, though her memory of their early encounters had grown decidedly rosier with the passage of time. "How are you feeling today, dear?" Mrs. Patterson inquired, settling into her favorite chair with the proprietary air of someone who considered herself essential to the clinic's proper functioning. "You mustn't overexert yourself in your condition, though I suppose all this experience with medical matters will serve you well when your time comes." Margaret smiled at the older woman's concern, recognizing the genuine affection that lay beneath her sometimes overbearing attention. "I feel wonderful, Mrs. Patterson. Samuel has been very careful to ensure I don't take on more than I should, and I've never been healthier or happier in my life." The truth of that statement struck Margaret with renewed force each time she spoke it. The woman who had arrived in Cedar Ridge as a desperate mail-order bride carrying twin babies and nothing but shame now commanded respect throughout the territory for her medical skills and compassionate care. She had found not just a place to belong but a purpose that utilized every aspect of her nature and experience. Samuel completed his examination of the injured woodcutter and joined Margaret and Mrs. Patterson, his presence at her side as natural as breathing after a year of marriage that had deepened their partnership in every aspect of their lives. His hand found hers automatically, a gesture of connection that had become as unconscious as it was constant. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone that usually preceded important announcements, "that we should consider expanding the clinic. Word of your skills has spread beyond Cedar Ridge, and we're getting requests for assistance from settlements 50 miles away. Perhaps it's time we trained some of the local women in basic medical care so they can serve their own communities." Margaret felt her heart swell with pride at the recognition that her abilities had grown beyond anything she had imagined possible during those first desperate weeks in the mountain town. The idea of teaching other women to heal and help their neighbors appealed to every aspect of her nature, combining her love of medicine with her desire to lift others from the kind of desperation she had once known. "That sounds wonderful," she replied, her mind already racing with possibilities. "We could hold classes here in the clinic, teach basic wound care, herb preparation, childbirth assistance. Give women the confidence to handle emergencies until proper medical help can arrive." Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly, her expression suggesting she had already appointed herself coordinator of any such venture. "There are several young wives in the surrounding settlements who would benefit greatly from such instruction," she declared. "And naturally, I would be happy to assist with the organizational aspects of the program." As the afternoon progressed, Margaret found herself reflecting on the strange turns that life could take, the way apparent disasters could transform into unexpected blessings when met with courage and determination. Her rejection by Thomas Whitmore, which had seemed like the final blow to her dreams of respectability, had instead opened the door to a life richer and more fulfilling than anything she had dared to imagine. The babies began to fuss as the day wore toward evening, their internal clocks as reliable as any timepiece in alerting the household to the approach of their bedtime routine. Margaret gathered them into her arms, marveling as she did each day at how much they had grown and changed, how their personalities were emerging with each passing week. Emma had developed her mother's quiet determination and her stepfather's gentle nature, while James showed signs of the quick intelligence that would serve him well in whatever path he chose to follow. Both children adored Samuel with the uncomplicated devotion that only the very young could offer, and he returned their affection with a paternal love that had healed the wounds left by his earlier loss. Samuel closed the clinic as the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, hanging the familiar sign that indicated he was not receiving patients except for genuine emergencies. The evening routine that had once seemed strange and temporary now felt as permanent and comforting as the mountains themselves, a rhythm of life that spoke of stability and belonging. As they climbed the stairs to their living quarters above the clinic, Margaret paused to look back at the room where so much of her transformation had taken place. Here she had learned that healing others could heal her own wounded spirit, that service to community could provide the belonging she had sought through more conventional means, that love based on respect and partnership could be stronger than any union founded on mere convenience or desperation. The mountain night settled around Cedar Ridge with the peaceful quiet that marked the end of good days, and Margaret settled into bed beside the man who had seen her potential when she could see only her failures, who had offered her partnership when she had expected only charity, who had given her love when she had thought herself beyond deserving such a gift. Outside their window, the first stars appeared in the clear Colorado sky, their light reflecting off the snow-capped peaks with the same crystalline beauty that had greeted her arrival more than a year ago. But now that beauty spoke not of harsh isolation but of protective embrace, not of barriers to overcome but of home to be cherished. Margaret placed her hand over Samuel's where it rested on her growing belly, feeling the gentle movement of the child who would be born into love and security, who would know from birth what she had spent a lifetime learning. That belonging was not something to be earned through perfection, but something to be claimed through the courage to serve others with an open heart. In the distance, a train whistle echoed through the mountain valleys, carrying new arrivals toward whatever destiny awaited them in the Colorado territory. Margaret smiled as she drifted toward sleep, hoping that among those travelers might be someone as desperate as she had once been. Someone who would find in Cedar Ridge the same miracle of transformation and belonging that had changed her life from a story of shame into one of healing, love, and hope fulfilled beyond all dreaming.